So design systems, style guides, everybody's doing this now. And Google, you'll see some examples from Google in my talk. Salesforce is a leader in this area. When I talk to in-house teams, all the executives want to ask the question, well, how does Spotify do design systems? Because Spotify does everything great from a team perspective. And I include the US Digital Service, that's the third row and third column, and gov.uk on here, because actually gov.uk had a woman who contributed to making that system, and she was like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go to Australia, and she's making a whole system for that government too. And I think it's just really wonderful to see all these stories about design systems. And in fact, Ashley from the Twitter design team got into Twitter and measured conversation about design systems. And you can see the progression and how people are talking about it a lot more. I remember that moment, it was in September 2014 when I opened up material design for the first time, and I said to myself, this content is so awesome. I'm actually not using material design in my work, but I feel like I'm a better designer now because I can see how they've modeled all of that. And then Salesforce happened the next year, and then it seems like every week there's a system success story on Medium. When people see these systems, they see a big library of parts. To them, it's a bunch of stuff they can reuse. And so here's an example of semanticui.com. They have header typography, they have error messages, they have list groups and icons, tabs and buttons and breadcrumbs. And then you go to Lightning Design System and they have headers, error messages, lists, icons, tabs, buttons, even Bootstrap. Everybody wants a mini Bootstrap for them, and lots of teams start here with their own libraries. All the same stuff. And so when we think about what systems give us, they give us those solutions to what are perceived as the easy problems, so that product teams can focus on solving the harder problems. And so my talk today here is to think about the quality of those systems, to think about the foundation of your color and your space and your buttons and other components that you build, because when you make systems, the assumption is that the quality of what they're going to use as a product team will at least be as good or exceed the quality that they're going to output. The criteria are high. And so when you're making a system, you have to be able to answer these questions. When your product teams ask, well, what do you mean by quality? How are you going to assure that the stuff we use, that you give, is good enough for you? What processes do you go through? And when you have that checklist, I think about the design first and the visual quality of each of those elements, whether it reaches all the different states and variations, if it needs to be responsive, how is it responsive, how resilient are these components to different lengths of content, is it composable with other components, plus the stuff you'd expect, functionality, accessibility, does it meet browser and device compatibility. That's the checklist, that when you make a component or a new variation of your component or you fix a defect, you're targeting a list of checkboxes like this so that you can promise to your customers, your product teams, that it's good. And so we make these big libraries. These big libraries are full of all sorts of different components. This is a slide I made for one of my customers in January when I was presenting to the product managers on the team and said, here's all the stuff you now get with the system, onward with your product development. And by them seeing it, instead of seeing a list of items or seeing the documentation site, they got it. They saw all those different things that were made for them. And we can focus in on the button as the first step in thinking about making a design system. In fact, all those properties of buttons, the padding, the margin, the background color, the border radius, the type size, whether you're making the text uppercase, those things set a stylistic tone for the entire library. Just like Brad talked about before, I think it was direct with the library, the principle that they had that meant no rounded corners. And so even here, buttons start to evoke those properties. Buttons get a little bit more complicated, though. When you put that nice primary blue button on a white background, it fits. But then when you start to reuse that button in a lot of different places, suddenly questions arise around, should I or shouldn't I? Does it work in that middle square on top of that blue gradient when the contrast between the background and the foreground is, at best, questionable? And so we ask ourselves the question of, when can I use and where can I use each of these components, and it gets complicated. In addition, to solve for buttons isn't just to solve for the save blue primary button, but buttons are the primary point of interaction. They are the best affordance on a page that screams, click me. And so when I'm going to interact with that element, has the designer thought through all of those other states? Are you going to have a progression indicator inside the button, even the questions around a single version of that button. And then you start thinking about other buttons. Well, what if we need a secondary button? Let's make it gray because the primary button's blue. Well, then when it's disabled, let's make that gray. And so what's the difference? The tip on making something disabled is also consider altering the text color too, because the text color of submit on the right-hand side, if that was disabled, would be clear as a disabled button. And then my favorite kind of button. Anyone want to scream out, what do we call these things? What's this kind of button called? Anybody? Ghost button. Anybody else got another name? Outline button. Hollow button. Empty button. Window button. What was the one you just said? Vacant button. Good. I've never heard that one before. That's awesome. But this thing's really dangerous. It looks so sophisticated, doesn't it? It looks so good, and then you put it on the designs, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't see it at all. It's called a ghost button because you can't see it. In usability tests that I've watched, that is very true, especially when paired with other kinds of interactive elements that have a background color, that have better contrast. If it's sitting alone on a page like you initially saw, I get it. But in a lot of other places, those things simply don't work. And can you predictably trust that you're going to have that button appear in a place that will have it have a high degree of contrast? And so we think about these challenges as systems people, and we go to principles like Brad talked about earlier. My favorite is principle number 4 of the Lightning design system. They talk about clarity and efficiency and consistency, but I'm drawn to the one that is beauty on the lower right-hand corner, and the reason is that last word in the description, craftsmanship. That when you make a system, that you're thinking through all of these details so that when somebody, your customer, your product designer or developer, doesn't have to worry about those things, that these pieces that they're using are well crafted. And then Etsy writes a story called Design for Growth, where they clearly articulate the button change that was very simple that they wanted to make, caused a code diff that looked like this. And suddenly, that craft in buttons woven through all of their systems is just way too complicated. It's not worth the change. It's so complex, and the potential regressive impacts of this button change are not predictable. And so we return to that button, and we think about, okay, if we're going to craft a good button, what do we need to solve for? We need to solve for the version of the button, as well as all sorts of other similar kinds of buttons. Maybe a button that produces a menu. My favorite, this split button. Or an icon-only button or button group. And then, yes, we got to tertiary, although I didn't have tertiary on there. One of those could probably be positioned as a tertiary button. And then the different states of the button, the different elements we want to use as a button, and all of the other qualities that the button needs to have. Is it responsive? Nah, buttons probably don't need to worry about it that much. Is it accessible? You certainly have to worry about that. Is it themable? How would you do that? Does the button look the same on all the different browsers that we have? And so a product designer, product developer, and a product QA person got together, and they made all those different buttons on that previous slide. And maybe they took 200 hours for all that stuff. And let's just, for the sake of round numbers, say they cost $100 an hour. Then that button costs $20,000. Is that an expensive button? There's a lot of button in that button on the last slide. There's a lot of choices, a lot of configurations that if you're serving a ecosystem of 50 to 100 product teams, I get it. You need to have those. $20,000 I'm good with. Except that the story was for one of those product teams. And when you're presenting buttons to executives as one of the triggers of having them invest in the system, this is what makes them scream, even in an ecosystem of 10 product teams. Because they're saying, I'm paying $200,000 for buttons, and I bet you all 10 teams are doing it differently. I bet you they all don't have the same answers. And that makes them want to scream. Brad has a great button inventory trick that you essentially do screenshots of all the buttons. That sensitizes them to appreciate the problem. But this kind of cost and lack of efficiency in how they're making product is unacceptable to many of them. In fact, the first question that I got in a pitch for a system last October was, how many fewer visual designers do I need when we make this system? Okay, that's not why I'm here. I'm not talking about reducing staff overhead, but maybe we can redirect all of their wonderful strengths to not focus on the button problem anymore. And so there's the submit button, and then there's the buy now button, because the submit blue button happens on products, and the buy now button, because it's red, and there is a lot of evidence that people are drawn to red buttons, particularly if associated with the word free right next to them, that you want to have on your e-commerce site. And so questions of color arise, and even hierarchies of systems arise, but that's for another day, products and marketing working together. And so we talk about color. And I am enamored by Google's 10 stacks. I love the array of colors that they provide for choosing the color of a button. Here the primary color is 700, and that starts the conversation when you go into a team and start to audit all of their different products, and you see the brand red of that huge organization across actually teams that were supposed to be working together, and you see all those different hex colors. I've been there a number of times. You're not trying to make all the designers feel bad because they don't raise their hand. I didn't code that. The engineer coded that, just like we saw earlier this morning. But we can't even get the direction of the gradient right. Is it diagonal? Is it from the top? And so when you work on design systems, you want to settle those brand colors early. If you're a bank, you're probably going to be some flavor of red and some flavor of blue. But you want to ground those so that decisions are stable, that people can trust, even in an early dot release of the system, that the basics of color are worked out. And if you're going to change some of the basics by working with, say, the brand team, where the brand group has brand orange, you want to saturate it more, you want to darken it up a bit for whatever your objectives are, like Brad said, collaborate with people, talk to people, open the borders between the different groups and different disciplines to have conversations. I really also love how many neutrals people have in their system. And a lot of times, all those neutrals in the middle, like the 30, 40, 50, and 60. In fact, those are really problematic neutrals. Not just because if you make a huge field of color on your interface and it's sort of a medium gray, it looks really gross, but it's a muddy accessibility danger zone. You have to avoid those middle grays. And in fact, you might have many grays near the edges and a single gray or a second gray right in the middle. And so that there are other basic choices too. What's our interactive color? It seems like every other system just chooses blue because links are blue, and everybody's familiar with the clickable thing like a button being blue. You shouldn't be embarrassed or have sort of self-loathing because you went with a blue interactive color, especially companies that have red as their primary brand color because they don't want to conflict or make it feel like everything's a warning. From a nameability perspective, you choose all your neutrals, you number them from 1 to 7, you have a bunch of variables, you start weaving them through, and then suddenly color 3.5 happens, and then color 3.25 happens. And so you want to avoid this kind of weird enumerated sequence that actually doesn't have any meaning other than the sequence by which you decided what the hex color was. So instead, consider enumerating them by the lightness value. I have success using HSL as the number, and that actually helps me understand that between 30 and 70, there's a whole wide array of grayscale that is not in use within the system. Also, when you look at systems like Material on the left, I love all those colors. They have 40 different tint stacks on their color page. And I've never worked with a product or an organization that needed all that color. Material exists to support so many more people than almost every system that we'll make in our lives. And so limit the color choices. Choose a primary orange, and then choose those orange shades and tints on the edges of that primary orange based on the hover or active state or whatever other accenting you need to do. And then when you choose those oranges, be consistent about, are we going to handpick those colors because we have total control over the predictability of what that color will be? Or are we going to allow, as a system community within our org, the ability to functionally transform those, to lighten and darken them using some Sass function, for example? I'm not as opinionated here, other than to say make a choice and stick with it. But I will say that hand-picked colors are more predictable from an accessibility perspective. You know what you're going to get when you start to combine those colors together. Another sub-palette is the success error, warning, and new color palette. You're going to have to choose also accents for those, probably maybe for a band of color for a block-level error message on the top of a page. And so we start to think about how all those colors are going to mix together. And so in my last year of work within systems, I work with about 3 to 5 system teams a year to build system releases. this is coming up a lot more. Not just how's everything look on a white background, but how can we make a system that can be themable or predictably show all the components on all sorts of color backgrounds that we choose? How can we wrap an area of the interface and everything within it magically recolors itself so that when we choose background color C, it just works? And so the first step in that process is choosing, are we going to just have a white and a system black, if not a pure black, as a background color? Are we going to have 4 backgrounds, actually, so that we can have light and dark toggled interfaces where we have a sidebar that maybe is darker than the main canvas, or a sidebar that is a light gray relative to the main canvas of the white? Are we going to have actually 8 different background colors that we need to model for? Because suddenly I'm thinking about a data structure in my head for all of those decisions that we're going to have to make around how all those pieces of text and other kinds of backgrounds that overlay work. And so we'll work in a sketch file that looks like this, and we'll start in the upper left, and we'll make all those basic elements. But then we'll copy them over to a second column, and a third column, and a fourth column. And as we copy them, we have essentially the starting point, or a sticker sheet, of what the library is going to be. And then as a designer, since we can trust the engineers on our team are going to model this data correctly, we can start to choose specific colors for each of those different dividers and background colors and more. In fact, most systems start with a cheat sheet of, can you fill in the blank, please? As a designer or as an engineer, I want you to identify across these 4 background colors, what's the primary text, secondary text, inline error text, interactive, blue link text usually, and disabled text. And so they make a bunch of choices. And they choose what each of those hex values are. In the case of what you're seeing here, actually the colors are the same for the light and the sidebar, or the first 2 rows. And they're the same for the third and the fourth row. But then after a while, we've modeled the data or the system correctly because we anticipated they're going to want to fine-tune those things. And one of the reasons they fine-tune those things is because of accessibility. This is a chart that we made to depict 4 different background colors, all that were dark, and then candidates for the primary text on the left. You can see secondary in the column labeled 80, interactive and error text on the right-hand side. And when we take those interactive and error colors, they clearly don't work. The contrast is terrible. They don't pass the accessibility thresholds for even AA18 or AA, let alone AAA, which is really a much stronger level of contrast. And so we fine-tune those values. We have background and border colors. You see that the inline error text on the right-hand side is white instead of red because it's associated with now an SVG that we're coloring the fill of the exclamation point just as much as we're coloring the outline portion or the filled portion of the red that surrounds the exclamation point. We're making those decisions because we're seeing how the components are displayed on all those different places. Each one of those border colors actually is unique per column. Each one of those header colors is actually distinct, although maybe your eye isn't picking them up. And each of those cards that we make, we start to have very deliberate discussions around, well, okay, if we're going to have a light-colored card on a dark background to have a really strong level of contrast, how are those 2 colors going to play with each other? And in the upper right-hand corner, we've got a light gray 95, let's say, on top of a light background, which is gray 90. So, yep, we're going to need a drop shadow to separate those 2 things. And that actually was the trigger moment that a drop shadow entered into our system fairly late on in our first release cycle when we were making those cards. I look at a lot of libraries in my work. Each of the columns here represents what might be fairly well-known library: Salesforce Lightning, Google Material, Walmart System, Semantic UI, Zurb Foundation, Bootstrap, US Web Design, Predix UI, and Etsy. And then I arbitrarily chose a range of background colors that are all fairly light, starting with white. And you can see, even there, did you feel like you could trust those systems since they're so popular? I don't want to come down on them hard. I've made a lot of mistakes too. But some of these have what I'll say questionable levels of contrast accessibility, even on a white background for the blue text. Even Materials button, white foreground, or white text on top of that saturated blue as a color, doesn't score that great from an accessibility perspective. And so we built a tool at my company, 8Shapes. It's called Contrast-Grid. You enter in a bunch of colors on the left-hand side, and you can have optional labels next to them. And we'll do this early, often, rapidly, as we're working through that sticker sheet to test all of these different things. You can even see at the bottom 3 rows, we have a blue that's effective on the extremes of background colors. You notice the FFF, leftmost column, and then the 000 black column. And then you have effective on lights or an ineffective blue. And getting the right blue to be well accessible across a range of background colors is almost an optimizing impossibility. But you do your best, and you try to at least solve it in good places. And so designers will see an early version of that sketch file, start copying those colors, and then a developer might see that same thing and use the InkDropper tool and take that totally inaccessible blue and put it into their code, and that's bad. And so at least let's start making some variables so that we enclose that particular system blue in a reusable form so that they can apply it to the background. I guess that's better. That's what I see when I look in a lot of systems, a lot of system-blue or system-blue.1-2-3-4, when I look at SAS files and, across different libraries. But what about the time when across an organization that has, say, 50 different product teams, you choose the right blue? You have a system team that's concentrating on all this optimization, and they want to apply that to buttons and links and some other accents. Okay, that's a good choice. That color is good, but then they look at the ecosystem of all the products and they say, oh my gosh, look at all those different repositories. They all have their own, most of them are well structured. They have a variables file somewhere in the repository that has all these SAS variables or less variables or stylus variables, or maybe if they're working on iOS or Android, it's in some XML file or JSON file. But those decisions are splayed all over the place. And so Brad talked about this too this morning, but I want to revisit this topic around design tokens. And Salesforce pioneered the abstraction of a visual system, put into data form, and then spread across a lot of products. Those design tokens can take the form of a lot of different visual choices, colors, but also how you're applying those colors to backgrounds, texts, and borders, font family, font size, line height, all sorts of different choices that you can essentially record in your token file. And then this is an example from a library I worked on last year called Comet. And this becomes a cheat sheet for all the developers, even if they're not using your markup, even if they're not using your components, but they just want to start hooking into a lot of the visual choices of your system because that's how much time they have to spend to bring it up to some level of adoption maturity. And also it's a cheat sheet for designers too. All those choices and their actual values associated with them, these little pills start to form the annotations instead of specific measurements or what have you, so that the conversation and the language between designer and developer improves. So that as a designer, I'm creating a card and I can say, okay, we've got the card overall, I want to have this amount of space underneath it, and I've got that little copy container underneath the thumbnail of the card, and here's how we want to use the background color and the foreground color for the text and the font size and the padding to inset all of those elements inside that block. And so we have those tokens, and we actually use YAML as a format. I'd never heard of YAML before, but it's a much more lightweight syntax that has the hierarchy. You can include variables in it, and it's much more readable than some of these other formats. And the thing is that these design decisions that go into that YAML file is a place where I try to create inclusivity for designers to then make pull requests against the repository. Those are the choices designers should control and model with their engineers, rather than just throw something over Slack and have the engineer create this hierarchy, because that hierarchy is very meaningful for designers. They can make those changes, and when they make a change, the build tools then propagate it out to convert it into JSON, which is then converted into all sorts of other files, and all of those other files become the dependencies that product teams use when making their own products. So I love tokens. I'm like a token architect because I was an information architect until I started being called a UX designer. So this is right up my alley. And so I started to think, well, actually, how much style complexity is there in all of these libraries that we work on? All these kind of variables and so on. And so I looked, actually, at 6 different libraries. When I was making Discovery Comet, you see there, that one in the bottom middle, I looked at an old library that I had worked on before for a company called NetApp, and then other major players like Zurb and Bootstrap Material and Salesforce Lightning. And I looked at all of the CSS in the entire repository of the library. And I stripped out all of the comments, all of the delimiters that were unnecessary, all the selectors, and I put all 11,500 declarations into a spreadsheet. And then I classified each one of those by particular categories, like type or space or color or layout. For example, like layout would be a float property, would be used for layout. And I also looked at whether or not they were hard-coded choices. You can see like on line 1640, that's a hard-coded choice of 2M, whereas on line 1633, it's referring to a base font size variable within the repository. Turns out Bootstrap and Salesforce Lightning both were around 80% variables with all of these, whereas mine were, I had something to aspire to. We were around 70% with that. But it made me appreciate how much you can really enclose into those kinds of token files. And here's what actually the complexity looks like. There's a ton of color, and there's also size and type and size and color combinations and so on. But if you look at the very top, Material Design Lite, with all of those 40 tint stacks they have to support, there's a ton of color. And if you took Material Design Lite out of this, the most used property type is space, not color, which gave me a lot of inspiration when I think about padding, margin, left, right, top, and bottom. That's what properties correspond to space here in this analysis. There's more of those choices than any other kind of visual property within our systems. And so I return to the button and I think to myself, yeah, there is a lot of space in button. The padding on the top and the padding inside the button, the margins outside the button, and how it relates composably to all the other things in the library. There's a lot of space everywhere. And you know what? Spacing can be so sloppy in our design artwork. It's something that we kind of avoid. And I look at this card and I think to myself, well, it's got a lot of elements in it, but I think it looks pretty well spaced out. And then you hand it off and the engineer that's supposed to build this thing says, what's with 22, 26, 12, and 28? Is this what it's supposed to be? Because I just coded it, committed it, and it was merged, and because that's what the design file had in it. That's totally not a system of space whatsoever. That's just a designer not even pixel pushing their own comp. So instead, we need to do space. So, well, let's make a grid. Because that's what space is, how we create visual order and an overall page layout. We've got gutters of 32s that are green. We've got margins that are 32s at the edge of the viewport, perhaps, or the edge of some big block of our layout. And we feel like we're done with space. But grid is not space. Grid is a component that uses space. It just so happens that grid is invisible to us, and it makes us feel like we've got a starting point to put all our parts in. But there's so much more space built into all of the individual components. And so we need a system for space. And so people say, I've got a magic number, it's 6. Everything is going to be 6 in our system. And why is 6 awesome? Because it's 2 times 3. And when you have 2s and 3s, you can create almost any number except prime numbers up through like what, 18, maybe 21. In fact, you go like 12, 15, 16, 18, you can have any of those as options. I'm like, why would you want all of those options? That's crazy. Because there's not an appreciable difference between 15 and 16 when you're thinking about space. Whereas 16 and then powers of 2 actually becomes a much more meaningful choice. And that is a geometric progression, which to me, as a mathematician, I have a degree in math, I really just love because I like to have formulas on the screen. But when we made our spatial system for that comment repository, or that comment library that we made, the medium size, that 16 size, was used 41% of the time. You can see the step up to 8 and the step down to 32 represented almost 90% of the spatial choices that we had where we were using those particular values. And that's a lot better than linear, and the reason is not because we don't need 4 and 8, maybe 12, need 16, but because there's no appreciable, meaningful difference from a space perspective between 28 and 32, and then 32 and 36. You don't need all those choices. And so, well, we've got these stops. What are we going to name them? And I said, Kevin, I really love Gmail's cozy, comfortable, and compact labels. I just sit there and play with that thing. I'm like, look at my thing spaced out, and then it becomes a little more dense, and then it becomes more comfortable, and it becomes more dense. Let's use those terms. And he's like, okay, what are you going to call the bottom two? I said, oh, what do you think of teeny and Spartan? You like, that was good? And luxurious, everything is luxurious here. When it gets really big, it's luxurious. I'm not even going to go any more with that. Okay? Let's stay away from luxurious. It's a bad term for talking about space in design systems. And so, no, those aren't good labels. We go with t-shirt sizes or something like from 1x, the proportional difference going in either direction. and suddenly we have a better way to think about turning the dial of space. We went with t-shirt sizes. I kind of regret it now. I wish we would have gone with this kind of system, because those are, actually that should be 4x, sorry, that's a typo on the slide. I hope somebody caught that. But to me, that's still not getting at the root of thinking systematically about space. We're just talking about how much space are we going to have in all these places, as opposed to how are we using space? What are the different kinds of ways that we're spacing things out within our repository? I start with the box model. Most of the stuff I do is the web, almost all. And so I think about, well, how's an engineer going to make and space out things? And I look at that card and I add these dashed lines, because in my mind's eye, that's how I'm thinking about the space model actually working. And when I think that way, suddenly I can create different concepts of space that help me differentiate between here the pinks and the blues and the oranges and the greens. And what those correspond to were concepts that we wove through using a new vocabulary for that system, and we've stuck with it for libraries that we've built since. Because when we talk about an inset, or we talk about a squished inset, that has a different spatial perception of how that works. And so inset was the basic one. You can think of it as padding, but remember, we're trying to use these decisions across platforms. If we want to inset from the edge of a gray box, the card has a regular medium-sized inset. The error message has a large inset. The galaxies pill and the icons button might be using a small inset. But for things like buttons, data tables, and list groups, we wanted to have a predictable way that it was more inset on the side than on the top of the bottom, almost as if you had taken that box and you had pushed it down, squeezed it like a cheeseburger. And so that inset squish happened in a lot of components. We have a pagination component that also looks like this too. And so, well, if we have squished inset, then we clearly must have an inset stretch, where it feels like you're stretching out the form control, like a text box in a text area. Well, we're making a system, we've got all these spatial concepts, let's add the stretch concept. Except we never used it anywhere else. And so even when you're creating useful concepts to weave through your libraries, or foster collaboration or clear communication between people, make sure that when you're going to reuse something, get to the second or third time of reuse before you really institutionalize it with some value within your system that is globally available. This is now in our tokens file. It's a total distraction. When people see all that, they're like, oh, what do I use that for? And we say, pretty much nothing. Don't reuse it, because we have no use for it. And so you don't want to get caught in that. Stack things. We stack things all the time. And so what's our stacking system? It's not about baseline typography and that stuff, which I am not an expert at. But how can we have a simple set of stacked options so that we can space things out, and the address label can be more associated with the two boxes below it than the last name text box that's above it? And how can we think about within a component the separation of the card's video label as a type and the supernova title versus between components, how there's a bit more space that will stack it when those cards are displayed in some vertical arrangement. Inline is similar. How are we going to separate things out that are flowing in line and might wrap? And then once we have those spatial concepts, we revisited the grid and said, okay, we have a good sense of what these numbers are, and they're now more meaningful, and we're now going to change the grid component to use those spatial concepts that we have. And so it became a pretty simple cheat sheet. When we go to other designers within the org and we say, you're spacing stuff out, what do you think about using these principles? And you can look at the component library also to understand how to apply many of them. And they say, we got it. We're good. Those aren't that many options. That's not that complicated. We can move forward with that. What if we need helpers? Well, suddenly these helpers that are available, and they do get used, they're still around. They help us get over the hump of where we need some special sauce in a particular declaration, or we're just applying it to a padding left instead of a padding overall for an inset, or things like that. But guard against those. That's almost my way of looking through a pull request, and I always hone in right on the changes to the tokens file and the changes to the CSS, because I'll look for uses of helpers, and I'll say, can we be more specific? And I have a way to talk with the engineers that are working on components to fruitfully have those conversations. Another thing that really helped us be successful was we solved this line height problem. Some might not think of it as a problem, but we always think of it as this pesky thing that when you have a line of text like video, that there's a certain amount of space that's unpredictably put on top and bottom of that text. And so we wrote a mix-in that essentially crops it out. We did a lot of math. There's a formula like Sarah's thing this morning. It has about the same number of factors. but it takes the before and the after element of that particular element, like the video tag that you see there at the top, and it just crops it. It essentially uses a reverse margin, a negative margin, to bring that in predictably based on a default line height or some other line heights that the system typically uses. So that was really helpful, and it helped us not just because we wanted to have a quick way to crop stuff, but suddenly the stuff we build uses tokens that correspond to what the designers see in their comps. And that's the connection that was most meaningful to me. And so we make things like cards, and you can see those inset and stack concepts woven through. You do see a couple spacers in there as well. Nobody's perfect, but if I was to make a card, clearly these concepts are straightforward for me to follow, and suddenly it's a quick conversation for us to have between a designer and an engineer. We got about 90% coverage with those spatial concepts. We hard-coded a few things, particularly in the documentation side of the system that we made, but when we were making components that other people are going to use and we want to tune the dial of space, most of the things we can trust are woven throughout the entire library. In fact, even though it wasn't a requirement, the director of UX that was working on a set of products for younger kids said, I really wish we could just take our products and puff them out a bit, because kids that are kindergarten through third grade need a bigger UI, they need bigger targets, we need bigger type. And I said, well, you can change the insets but not affect the stack like this, and you can just weave that through the whole library, and it's like 2 lines of code. And suddenly, her eyes lit up. Not because she had a solution for the specific project that she was on, but I was excited to see that she saw the opportunity of thinking systematically about how to approach her color, her buttons, her space. And so I write a lot about this stuff. I'm on Medium. I probably write once every couple of weeks. The things that I talked about here are from a few articles that I've written in the past, but I talk a lot about running a systems team, thinking about it like a product, and in other topics too. If you're interested at all in this design system stuff, Gina from Salesforce set up a Slack channel, and I'm one of the other admins, and we're about 2,500 people in an open Slack community that are talking about Theo, the Salesforce tool, tokens, code, working with products, all the different channels for different topics of working with systems. So join us there. It's free. Just go to this website, and it'll auto-invite you via email to that. So thank you very much.